Hey everyone, welcome to our next video in the Mixing with 5 plugins series. Today we're going to talk about adding space. As you remember last time, the mix was sounding fairly balanced. You could hear everything that was going on, but it sounded a little flat. That's just because most of the instruments are bone dry and all occupy the same region there. So if you think about it, the mix is now very two-dimensional. It's panned, so there's stuff from left to right, and it's EQ and compressed, so all the instruments sort of work where they are, but there is no front to back. It's all in the front, so it's hard to enjoy listening to it like that. So because spaces are so subjective, this will be an interesting video because I might derail the mix a little bit here. The reason is that there are so many different ways to use reverb and delay, and I'll probably try to cram in as many mix techniques using these processors as possible using these tracks. So at the risk of adding too much reverb to the mix or adding too much crazy stuff, just know that it's for the sake of teaching you different things you can do. Who knows, maybe I'll end up with something really interesting. And of course, I'll try to reel everything in at the end. And also because there are so many different reverbs out there, I'll try to use one that's not overly complicated, but still has enough buttons on it. So I have these three open, and I'm going to go through some of the parameters here first, and then I'll start working them into the mix. In every reverb, we have some of the same parameters to fiddle with. The more basic reverb plugins only have one or two parameters, but some of the more advanced ones have almost unlimited capabilities for customization. But I wanted to find one of the super simple ones, and I think the digital reverb here. This is one of the simple ones. The plugin mixed reverbs, or the plugin mixed plugins in general, are super simple. They all look like this, and they all have just 3 or 4 knobs. So this is basically, you have your small, medium, large sizes. You have your EQ here, and you have your early reflection levels, and you have your decay time. So basically, you have a large setting, but you can make it even larger by making the decay time longer. Basically, it takes the reverb longer to die down. And the early reflection level is basically the amount of early reflections in the reverb itself. I think Plugin Mix has another reverb here. Let's see. Yeah, it also has the digital plate. That's more or less the same. Yeah, it's even simpler. So it just has time, dry, wet, color, dark or bright, and level of the reverb. But let's go over some parameters here. Usually what you get is a room size or type. You can usually choose how big you want your reverb to be. This can be either selected as a predetermined reverb mode, which we'll get to later, or just the size of the reverb in seconds. So like a 0.5 second reverb sounds much shorter and smaller than the longer, lush 3.3 second one. Obviously, that's fairly self-explanatory, but a 0.5 second reverb is more like a room sound. Say you were to clap in a classroom, it would take about a half a second to die down. Whereas if you're in a big auditorium and you clap, it'll take maybe 3 to 4 seconds to die down. All right, then you have pre-delay. Pre-delay is on most reverbs, or not all of them like here, but most of the ones that are all kind of all-in-one reverbs that are more customizable. But pre-delay, you can use pre-delay to distance the reverb from the source sound. So think of pre-delay like the distance to the walls. So by adding more pre-delay, you're pushing the walls back, allowing more time between the source sound and the reverb. This can be good when you have a big ballad with lots of reverb on the vocal, but you don't want to drown out the phrases of the singer with too much reverb. So basically, the singer gets to sing without the reverb coming on immediately. You basically keep the reverb from starting in milliseconds by using pre-delay. Early reflections are all the combined reflections that happen after the original source signal. Theoretically, since these early reflections are the first reflections that bounce back from the nearest walls of our imaginary space, our ears can pretty accurately gauge how large a room is supposed to be. If the early reflections are nearly instantaneous, we're in a small room, but if the reflections don't bounce back as quickly, we can determine that we are in a larger space. So in the Valhalla room, for instance, you can actually customize both the early and the late reflections. And in a lot of reverbs like this, you should be able to do that with this waveform right here, but we won't get into that. So damping is another parameter you might find. It's not on any of these ones, but most rooms have all sorts of things that absorb higher frequencies. the carpet on the floor, the couch in the middle of the room, as well as any blankets and clothing you have lying around. So like in my room, for instance, I have a lot of acoustic treatment that is damping for this particular room because it's not as reflective, because I have so much damping or absorption on the walls because it is a studio. But by using the damping factor on our reverb, you're essentially determining how much high frequency energy is absorbed. So some reverbs have damping parameters for both high and low frequencies, and it works very similar to EQ. So you can sort of do the same thing by either putting an EQ before, after the reverb, or using the built-in reverbs in the plugins themselves. Density is another parameter. How dense do you want your reverbs to be? The more dense a reverb is, the more the reflections continue to reflect and pack together, creating a thicker sound. The lower the density, the more space between each reflections, creating something that's more similar to distinct echoes instead of a natural reverb. So, because if you clap, or if you make a loud noise in a very reverberant, very dense place, you get this big combination of all the reflections coming back. But if you have a lower density, you basically get all of the reflections separately, which will sound more like an echo or a delay. Diffusion determines the rate at which the reflections scatter and die down. A diffuse space is usually a controlled live space with reflections that don't pack together but rather disperse and die down. Then you have frequency filters. Most high-quality reverbs have dedicated EQ controls on them. You can see the EQ frequency filters here. These are just the shelvings here. They allow you to filter out either unwanted highs or unwanted lows. This can be good if there's too much low bass in your reverb cluttering up the mix, or if there's too much high energy hiss annoying you, or if, say you have a reverb on a vocal and it's just the reverb is too bright, you can keep the space of the reverb intact by just filtering out the highs of it. And then you have the wet-dry mix. Reverb are time-based effects and therefore should almost always be used as a send effect rather than an insert. I actually did break that rule last week, but by using them as a send, you can treat the reverb separately from the original source, allowing you more control over your source and reverb signal. And it also makes it easier if you have it on a bus and you want to send multiple tracks to the same reverb, as we will do later on here, because then you don't have to add the same plugin on multiple tracks. You just send a little bit of all of those tracks to one bus. All right, then we'll get to the reverb modes. The spaces around us all sound different. The spacious reverb you get by walking into a European cathedral is not the same as you would get from walking into your living room, obviously. These spaces interact with each other, sounding bigger and bigger as there's more of it. So audio engineers know how the different spaces sound and what we can accomplish musically by choosing the right space to give our songs. The different spaces we can choose from in our productions are called room modes. So reverb modes are basically categories of different spaces that have a distinct character and sound, and we'll go over a couple of them. So as you can see here, they have presets for a bunch of these different room modes. So we have room, hall, chamber somewhere here. I think I have chamber here in the preset. Yeah, chambers. We have these are impulse responses, and we have plates. This is a plate. This was also a plate here. So let's go over them. Rooms evoke feelings of smallish spaces with low ceilings. It can sound like a bathroom. Everybody sounds great singing in the shower, right? Or a small studio room. The sound a room makes is not as lush or as big as a hall, but it does have its character and uses when you need to give an instrument a little space and depth. Halls are big and plentiful. You can add small halls to things, but it's not unusual to use hall reverbs to add lush, big reverbs to vocals, big drum kits, and other things you want to make sound like it's being played in a big hall. Small halls still sound bigger than small rooms, and they have a more reflective quality than a room. A chamber, as we can see here are a few chamber presets. Chambers were the first kind of real reverb that was created in the studios back in the old days by playing the music through speakers down in reflective chambers that had a microphone that picked up the music with the reflections of these echo chambers. The first natural reverb devices were born. Chambers can sound big, but usually they do not have as many early reflections, giving the sound more space without audible reflections. Okay, then we have plates. Plates are mechanical reverbs and aren't really an emulation of any specific space. Plate reverbs are big electromechanical plates that vibrate with the music, with pickups picking up the reverb vibrations that the plate is giving off. Typically, since the metal plate reverb vibrates pretty fast, the sound is full of early reflections and high density. Plates are popular for drums, especially snares. Then we have spring reverb, and if you've ever played guitar, you do know what spring reverb is. It's basically all the reverbs that are in your guitars. Well, maybe nowadays we have more digital reverbs in the digital emulation, in the digital amps, but spring reverbs are the mainstay of 60s surf music. You can also really hear very easily in Miserloo is sort of a good example of what plate reverb or what spring reverb sounds on a guitar. So how it works is that sound is sent through springs, which reverberate and create that boingy, springy sound. Basically, if you kick your amplifier that has spring reverb, you'll hear that. It's basically the first thing you hear when you put Miserloo on. But spring reverb is mostly used on guitars, but don't be afraid to experiment and see if you can pair your spring reverb with something else entirely. So it's fun to, if you say you're supposed to put maybe a plate on a vocal, or that's what people usually do, or whatever. But use the weird reverb, see what you can come up with if you're in a very experimental mood. So then you have impulse responses, and this is basically an impulse response device. They're like sound pictures of a room. You can take audio snapshots of famous studio rooms, your own basement, or your dining hall, and use it in your productions. There are some reverb engines that only work with preloaded IRs, like this one, and they come fully stocked with great sounding rooms, halls, plates, and every other room mode you would ever want. So this is a really, really good one-stop shop for reverbs, but we'll use a few different ones in the tutorial. Also, if you have something and you want to load an actual impulse response into this one, you can do a quick Google search and you can find people that have taken IRs of everything you can think of, from the pipes in their sink to the space inside their mouths. You can accomplish some pretty weird sounds using these warped and alternative impulse responses. So that's basically the parameters, the gist of everything, what you can find in a reverb. Some are more complicated than others. This one's actually pretty complicated. I haven't really gotten to, whenever I put my mouse on here, you can see what it's supposed to do. But what I usually do is I find a preset that I like, and then I tweak these ones, because this is sort of the most important part of the Valhalla room. This is the depth, controls the perceived distance from the source. Basically a combination of early and late energy. Then this is the high cut. Basically, if you want to put a filter on the highs, this is where you do that. And then this is just the decay. So basically the bigness of the room, or the bigness of this particular preset. And then you have a pre-delay, which basically sets the amount of delay before the reverb, as I was talking about earlier. Basically pushes the reverb from starting until a certain delay is met. And then you have the mix, and we'll be using 100% mix here, because we'll be using it as a send. All right, I'm gonna go to work and see what I can do here, and I'll debrief you later.